and welcome to Change is Possible podcast. My name is Ani Filipova and I'm your host. When I left my banking career to try something new, the number one question everyone asked me was, how did you find the courage? The thing is, it's not about the courage. It is about knowing what you want and planning for it. That's why I started this podcast, to help you make your career change possible. Each of our guests have done a successful career change, and we are going to discuss practical advice, actionable tips, and inspirational stories that can help you to get unstuck and transition into work that you love. Let's get started. My guest today is John Wood. He's the founder of Room to Read, an organization that has brought the lifelong gift of education to over 20 million children in 20 countries. Room to Read has built 2,500 schools, opened over 46,000 multilingual school libraries, and funded long-term scholarships for over 125,000 girl scholars. To start Room to Read, John left a fast-paced global career with Microsoft. John is also an author of 3 books, including the best-selling one, Leaving Microsoft to Change the World. At the invitation of Bill Clinton, John served 4 times on the advisory board of the Clinton Global Initiative. He is a 5-time winner of Fast Company magazine's Social Capitalist Award, has been honored with Time magazine's Asian Heroes Award, and was selected as a young global leader by the World Economic Forum. In 2014, Queen Sylvia of Sweden awarded John with the World Children's Prize, also called the Children's Nobel Prize. Very recently, John launched his second social venture, and you'll hear from him about it. Hi, John, and welcome to the podcast. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you as my guest and to speak to you.
I'm happy to be here.
Great. Let's start it then. And let's dive with the first question. People always connect you with the Room to Read, but can you tell us about your career before that?
Very definitely. I went through a lot of career transitions, as a lot of people do, especially when you're young. You're trying to figure out what life is all about and what really work connects with you. I started out of the University of Colorado, where I was a finance and accounting major, went to Deloitte in Chicago for my first real job. E.g. not delivering pizzas.
Yeah.
Worked at Deloitte as an auditor for 2 years. Didn't really enjoy that much. I kind of viewed that as a bridge to something else. I got my CPA. I took the GMAT exam. I went to the Kellogg School at Northwestern. Loved Kellogg. Was really happy to be there. Then went into commercial banking for 2 years and didn't really like commercial banking. I felt like I was kind of a young man in an old man's job. And then fortunately, a good friend of mine happened to have gone to Microsoft right after the IPO. They were growing very rapidly. They were literally throwing bodies at problems. Yeah, they were hiring smart people, but they also let me in. And so in 1991, I left the cold winter of Chicago to get to the soggy spring of Seattle and joined Microsoft, actually working directly under Melinda Gates, then Melinda French, now Melinda Gates, in the consumer software side of the business. And had a really awesome 8-year run at Microsoft from 91 until 99.
Well, this is so interesting. I never knew that you were an auditor and then a banker. That's a surprise.
Yeah, not something I usually lead with.
So what happened? How did you decide to leave Microsoft? What were the driving factors?
I was really lucky that during my years at Microsoft, although I was originally very junior, what happened was that, of course, the 90s were major growth years for Microsoft. It was, I think, the most successful public equity of that period. So holding the stock was really great. I was relatively junior when I started out, but what happened was because the international and global markets were growing so quickly, they were often looking for people at the headquarters who could go off and work in the frontier markets, whether it be Taiwan or South Africa or Dubai, wherever it might be. And I kept putting my hand up because I was not married. I had no kids. I love to travel. And I was just like, this is nirvana. I get to travel around the world on Bill Gates' credit card, developing a lot of frontier markets. And eventually, some of my bosses said to me, why don't you just move to South Africa or Dubai or Sydney or Hong Kong and base yourself out of there rather than commuting across this huge ocean called the Pacific? And I loved the idea. So I ended up getting promoted to be director of marketing for the Asia Pacific region, and then eventually was moved to Beijing to run business development for Microsoft's Greater China region, covering the mainland, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. And it was a great time, Ani. I mean, I really enjoyed it. I learned so much. But after about 8 years there, I started to get to the kind of the Groundhog Day, the burnout of just every year. Just felt like it was a repeat. You're always in the same cycle of annual planning, budgeting, performance reviews. And I just thought, I don't know, I'd seen some things in my life that made me realize that there probably could be and maybe should be life after Microsoft.
I see. Yeah, I remember this time every single year, one and the same thing, the budget for next year, then all the activities around it. So you decided there needs to be a change. And what happened next? How did the plan for Room to Read emerged?
Yeah, I would say the plans for Room to Read kind of emerged simultaneously with my decision to leave Microsoft. I don't think one drove the other. I think they both drove each other. So what happened for me is in 1998, I needed a break from Microsoft. I took a 3-week trip to Nepal to go trek the famous Annapurna circuit, which is a wonderfully gorgeous 18-day trek around these 7,000 meter peaks. And on the second day of my trek, I met a headmaster in a little village called Bahundanda. And the headmaster said to me, would you like to come see the school? And I thought, yeah, great. Show me your school. This is a chance to see the real Nepal rather than just the tourist or the trekkers version of Nepal. And in this little school, it was simultaneously hopeful because 400 kids were showing up every day, eager to learn. But it was also just rather sad and slightly pathetic. The school was dilapidated. They had a dirt floor. They had no windows. They had a library room, but it was completely devoid of books. They didn't have children's books in their library. And I said to the headmaster, why? How can you be missing something so basic? And he said, well, in Nepal, we are too poor to afford education. But until we have education, we'll always remain poor. And that just struck me as one of the topic sentences of poverty. My grandfather had a 4th grade education, and he never got out of poverty. My father was the only one of 7 children in his family to go to university. He went on a scholarship. And I just thought about that, and I thought, wow, I love books. I love reading. I've loved reading since I was 3 years old. I've always just been a huge fan of libraries. And so I told the headmaster, I'd like to help you. And he said, perhaps you will someday come back with books. And if you do that, you'll be rewarded by all the smiles on the faces of my students. And so I went back a year later with 3,000 children's books, 6 donkeys. I wish I could show the image of the donkey train with my 73-year-old father and I going to these schools to drop books off. And even at the schools where there was celebration and joy and jubilation that these kids had books, I met headmasters who had walked 3 hours one way to this little village to hand me a letter saying, I want to petition you. My school also needs books. Can you come back next year? And I was like, I could, but maybe I shouldn't come back next year. Maybe I should come back next week. Maybe Microsoft should not be my future. Maybe doing this little project. And I never realized it would get as big as it got. It was just driven by passion. I thought, how do you say no to a headmaster? How do you say no to a student? And so the worst journey of my life was leaving Nepal in April of 1999, flying back to Beijing, and knowing I would have to blow up my life, say goodbye to Microsoft, say goodbye to my career, and say I've exit Microsoft, enter the Himalayas.
And you didn't test this while you were working, or you just left and dived into Room to Read without any preparation?
Yeah, I would say I had very little preparation. I was not qualified to do what I was doing. And I was nervous about leaving Microsoft. But my friend Mike McSherry, who's now a health tech CEO in Seattle, was visiting me in Beijing. We were off climbing on the Great Wall. And he said, dude, there's 2 ways to rip off a Band-Aid, slowly and painfully or quickly and painfully. And you're doing it slowly. And the reason we're having this conversation is I thought maybe I could just do Room to Read part-time and still do Microsoft full-time. But I knew, Ani, that if I was at Microsoft, they would always set my agenda. That annual planning cycle you and I discussed would always set the agenda. And so I realized I could do Room to Read as a hobby, but there's one issue with hobbies. Hobbies don't scale. The only thing that scales is going into full startup mode, being a founder, working 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. So I jumped out of the Microsoft airplane and I just prayed my parachute would deploy.
Great story, John. It's so interesting. I've heard this, but hearing it again, it is as interesting as the first time. So from a well-paid corporate career into a non-profit, how does this happen financially?
Yeah, it feels like walking a tightrope without a safety net. So, I can be really candid. I didn't have a gazillion dollars. I didn't have that much money, but I had enough that I knew I could work for no salary for at least 3 years. I thought it'd be longer than that, but of course, I was doing this in 2000 when the tech market imploded, and I had most of my savings in Microsoft. So I thought I'll have 5 or 6 years I can work for no salary. Then I can always go back and work for the man, go back and work for some other tech company. And then, of course, the market, went down by 40, 50%. So then I was like, okay, I'm down to about 3 years that I can work for no salary and still survive. And I did that. And I just told myself that if Room to Read's making 100,000 or $500,000 a year of donations, I can't take a salary with a straight face because then people are just paying the organization to pay me. So I worked for free for about 3 years. And I think we were at least 3 million of revenue when the board gave me a salary of 80,000 a year. Now, keep in mind, I was living in San Francisco, so 80,000 a year barely covers your living expenses. But I was like, okay, I'm going to work my way into this. I started doing some public speaking. So companies ranging from Fidelity to Credit Suisse to others would bring me in as a speaker and say, tell us how we can apply the lessons of business to the world of philanthropy. So I kind of had a few side gigs here and there. I made a little bit of side income. I did a few consulting projects here and there. But my real goal was to never have to do anything. Room to Read is really my true passion. I wanted to devote every minute of my life to getting Room to Read to serious scale. And that really mattered to me because in the early years, the founding team, which includes Dinesh Shrestha in Nepal and Erin Ganju, who was an ex-Goldman, ex-Unilever, Erin also did the same thing. She had left Unilever and said, I want to be full-time social change agent. So we were really lucky to be able to meet up and be able to join forces to work together. And the whole idea we had was, okay, we got to raise money quickly because we have literally hundreds of villages asking us, can you help us to repair our school? Can you help us to expand our school? Can you help our school have a library? Can you fund scholarships for the young women in our villages so they can go through secondary school? And it was just painful to say no. So I basically became a full-time road warrior, a full-time fundraiser. You've seen me certainly. And during your days at Citibank, Citi was very generous and very responsive to my requests to put funding into Room to Read. And so we were just off to the races. It wasn't until our fourth year that we raised about $3 million. But it's probably the last 5 years, we've been able to raise north of $50 million a year. And that's for a charity to raise literally on average $1 million a week. It took a long time to get there. It took a long time to build that funding base, but it was worth doing. We had a fun time doing it. I logged literally millions of miles, was rarely home, but I was on the road and it was fun because rather than being on the road for Microsoft, now I was on the road for the world's children. I was on the road to help kids in post-Khmer Rouge Cambodia, kids in post-Civil War Sri Lanka, to get a return to normalcy and have a chance to go to school every day.
This must have been so interesting to live this life, and it sounds so inspiring to be able to do these things. But I can't imagine that you had no doubts when you started Room to Read. So can you share with me some of these doubts and how you overcome them?
Yeah, one of the problems of being a cash-strapped NGO is if you really want to raise serious money, you really need to go talk to really wealthy people. And it was a little disconcerting, barely being able to make my rent in San Francisco and then going to somebody's $30 million home in Aspen for a fundraising event and kind of looking around and realizing that, like, I'll never have this. Like, I've chosen a very different path. That was more minor. That's something I can joke about. I think the toughest part of it really was the number of people who are really condescending to me, the number of so-called charity experts who would tell me all the reasons this wouldn't work, the number of people who'd spend time with me and they would give me all kinds of advice, but then they wouldn't write a check. And there are a few things I despise, and that's a strong word, but it's a word I'll stick by. There are a few things I despise more than wasting time. Wasting your own time and wasting other people's time. I think to waste another person's time is really disrespectful. And so the toughest thing for me in the early years was spending time with people who would then, after 3 meetings, say, yeah, I got other priorities. I'm like, well, then why did we take the second meeting? Why did we take the third meeting? Thankfully, that was very rare. The majority of people, 90% plus I met up with, were super supportive. They got it. But it doesn't mean there weren't really, really tough days. And I think philanthropy, charity, that whole sector is blatantly inefficient in many ways. The corporate world, it can be inefficient, but capitalism has this wonderful gating device where if you don't keep your customers happy and you don't keep your employees happy, you'll go out of business. In the world of charity, it's not nearly as efficient, not nearly as straightforward, not nearly as causal. And so quite often it can be very capricious decisions by the rich that can make or break a social change movement. And that for me could be very frustrating when I was not on the receiving end of good news. How did I deal with it, Ani? I always told myself, buck it up, Skipper. These kids need you to remain optimistic. The kids we serve need me to remain in a positive glass half full mode. So I constantly reminded myself that no matter how bad my so-called problems were, those were minor in comparison to a little girl who didn't have a library in her village in Bangladesh, or in comparison to a young man who didn't have a chance to go to a school that had well-trained teachers. So I kind of dealt with it psychologically. I told myself my problems are really very elegant first world problems to have.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely can relate to that. What would you say to people who are planning to make the same change, just like you did, from a corporate life to a non-profit organization? What should they think about?
I think people, if they're going to make that switch, should think about the fact that there's probably a lot of people out there who will, the doubting Thomases, the Debbie Downers, people who will tell them all the reasons they shouldn't do it, people who will warn them of the risks of doing it, people will tell them that's crazy, you're sacrificing your financial stability. But I think the world needs business leaders to go lend themselves to social change. There's so many problems in the world today that are not getting solved. And I think one of the reasons that Room to Read did so well is that we recruited a lot of what I called corporate refugees to be part of the management team. We found people who had worked in private equity, and after 15 years in private equity, they said, I'm done. I've had enough. I want to do something that's more societally useful. We had people who had worked for Credit Suisse, and they loved the experience they had there, but they said, hey, I've had 5 years experience as an analyst. What if I applied that to grant writing? What if I applied that to writing really awesome reports that made a corporate donor say, wow, these guys at Room to Read really have their act together? My advice to people would be, go for it. It's not easy. It's not a clear path. There's going to be challenges, but we only have one life to live. And one day we're going to be sitting there at age, whatever, 70, 75, 80, 85, looking back in our lives and asking ourselves, what did I accomplish? What choices did I make? What things did I not do that I should have done? And I guess for me, when people try to talk me out of leaving Microsoft, I said, I don't want to be the guy who's sitting on the sofa at age 80 asking myself what might have been.
Yeah.
I want to look back and say, I went for it. I did it despite the challenges, despite the difficulties. I persevered. I got through it. And, Room to Read today, wow, 23 million kids in 20 low-income countries have access to opportunities they wouldn't have otherwise had. It doesn't mean the job is done. My mantra for myself when I advise others is stay hungry, stay humble. No matter what you've done, you better wake up hungry, and you better not act self-satisfied in public, or else people are going to really not like you. And you deserve that. I mean, there's nothing worse than an arrogant overachiever. I like humble overachievers. I
see. So you called your book Leaving Microsoft to Change the World, and you really did.
Yeah, but it's an ongoing process.
I know.
There's still a long ways to go.
Yeah, I know. But you did such a great step, such a great organization. Once you had Room to Read running, I know that you did many other things. What were they?
Yeah, well, what happened for me was about 2015, 2016. Room to Read is about 15, 16 years old. I had been the founding CEO. My co-founder, Aaron Ganju, had moved from being the COO to being CEO in 2008. And she had a really awesome run. So I had about 8 years. She had about 8 years. And then we hired our first non-founder CEO, Geeta Murali, who had been with Room to Read for quite a long time. We kept promoting her. She kept growing her span of influence within the organization. And when Aaron decided to step down as second generation CEO, The board did a wide search. We looked at outside candidates. We thought that we owed it to ourselves and to the organization to not just look inside. But the more we looked outside, the more we realized that our internal candidate, Geeta, was the strongest by far. And so she took the job. She was super happy. She was like really motivated. And I said to her sometime, I don't know, it was probably a couple of months, but I said, I want to do kind of an asymptotic line thing where I will give it room to read 80% of my time this year, and then 60%, then 40%, then 20%, and gradually work myself out of a job with room to read. And that was really out of respect for the management team, out of respect for Geeta, out of respect for the board of directors, to say the organization's strong enough now. If I had left in 2004, if I'd left in 2009 during the GFC, that would have had a profoundly negative influence on the organization's growth trajectory. By 2016, 2017, I said, hey, we're a going concern. So what I did is I just emailed a bunch of really, not a bunch, but probably about 10, 12 trusted friends. And I said, okay, I'm going to have some bandwidth. I'm not going to go take a full-time job, but I can do some part-time projects. And if you were me, what would you do? And I was just so lucky, Ani, because my friend Nick Nash, who at the time, he'd been with C Group as the chief operating officer when C Group IPO'd, the most successful tech IPO in the history of Singapore. He said, hey, don't tell anybody I'm starting a private equity fund in a couple of months. Why don't you join the board? Why don't you get involved with that? And then my friend Jennifer Staines, who runs her co-heads family office with 3 other co-founders in Chicago called Financial Investments Corp / Concentric, reached out to me and said, hey, we've been investing in the US for a long time. We've had a really good track record. We had a really good run. We want to start investing in Asia. And we don't know where to start. We don't know who to trust. We don't know who the good people are. We don't know who the people are who can help us to find the right deal pipeline. So do you want to be our Asia partner and represent the family office in Asia? And I was like, okay, be forewarned. I know nothing about private equity. And Jennifer and Ian and Ken and Frank, her partner, said to me, John, you'll learn, but most importantly, you have good connections. You can help us to figure out who are the people we should be talking to and who are the people we should be avoiding. And so all these different opportunities kept coming up. And so I transitioned into more of a portfolio phase of my life where I had 6 or 7 different projects. They all knew I was part-time. They all knew I did not want to be in an official capacity. I didn't want to be a CEO. I didn't want to be a board chair. And so I just started doing multiple things. And it was just so fun because after 16 years being all room to read all the time, I would still do room to read work, but I'd also be doing work with private equity, work with venture capital, and just learning a lot along the way from really brilliant people.
Great. So that was what, the 4th or 5th transition of what you're doing?
Yeah. I mean, I think if you transition too often, you'll never accomplish anything because you're just kind of jumping from thing to thing to thing.
Yeah.
But if you don't transition a couple of times in your career and your life, you stagnate. I can't even imagine doing one thing for your entire life. And so I've just always tried to keep my eyes open. And I think a lot of people will actually get to the points of their careers where when someone says, what do you do? It'll be difficult to explain because people will be in that phase of their life where they may be doing 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 things at one time. People, when they get to the point of being 50, 55, 60, may simply say, I've had it with the corporate grind. But my friend's doing a startup. I'm going to join her board. And this friend over here is doing something different in the charitable sector, and I can get involved in that. And really, for me, when I wake up every day and have 5 or 6 or 7 things I'm working on, that just excites me. Sometimes it's overwhelming because I feel like, I can't let anybody down. I'm wearing 7 hats now. But for the most part, it's just really, really exciting. And quite often, what I find is I'm even connecting dots between these different organizations I'm working with, and they end up sometimes doing co-investing with each other. And so it's been a lot of fun, but I've also, as you know, I've got another new thing going on, my second social change venture, which launched last week. And so that'll be, for me, one of the next big things for the coming years, 2022 through 2030.
Wow. Yeah, this is exactly what I wanted to talk about next. How this idea came to life?
Yeah, the organization is called YouGo, so capital U dash capital G-O. And YouGo is purposefully a double entendre. The U stands for university, but YouGo is a promise we make to young women in low-income countries around the world that they will go to university, that they will hopefully graduate from university, that they will be able to be the first in their family to have a really good white-collar job, maybe as a teacher, a nurse, a doctor, a pharmacist, a banker, who knows what they'll end up being. But what I found in all my travels when I visited Room to Read countries was that Room to Read was doing an amazing job helping young women get through secondary school. 125,000 young women have taken part in Room to Read's girls' education program over the years. And I'm so proud of the team for what they've done to be able to accomplish that. Quite often, however, I would be in a village, be it in Vietnam or Nepal or India, and the young women, their parent, their mother, father, grandmother, would come up to me and say, I want more. Secondary school is not enough. I want to be a nurse. I want to be a teacher. I want to be a doctor. And I can't do that because our family can't afford university. And so I kind of said, well, Room to Read's, can't be all things to all people. As a charity with a limited budget, you have to stay pretty focused on your core calling. But I started doing these little kind of side deals where I would give the parent my business card and say, here's my email address from your phone, from your local cyber cafe. Please email me and I'll help your daughter to go to university. And Ani, it was just like incredible energy into me to be getting reports from young women in Nepal who had literally gone across the border to India to go to nursing school, 16-hour bus rides, who are coming out, graduating, becoming nurses. Young women who would speak at the Room to Read galas, who were the lucky ones, the ones who found scholarship money, which is very limited, but ended up getting really good jobs and becoming teachers, really good jobs and becoming nurses, becoming doctors, becoming engineers. And I realized that in the same way that 21 years ago or 22 years ago, I looked at the lack of libraries in low-income countries and said, somebody should do something about this. I now look at lack of scholarships to university for young women in low-income countries and say, why is more not being done? In the countries where we're going to work at YouGo, less than 10% of the women even make it through the second year of university. So less than 1 in 10 even get through 2 years. But it's not that they're not talented. I know from my travels, and I quote Nick Kristof, one of my favorite writers, and of course, 2-time Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, who says talent is universal, opportunity is not. And so I looked at what my wife, Amy, and I had done with a couple scholarships here and a couple of scholarships there and said, what if we took this to scale? What if we on-randomized this and didn't just do a scholarship because we happened to be in a village in Vietnam and met a parent who wanted help? What if we systematically went out and tried to find partner NGOs to say, let's do scholarships for as many young women as possible? And it may shock your listeners to know that on an average cost of $800 US per young woman per year, we've helped now over 100 young women get into university and succeed. So it's a small amount of money. It goes a very long way. One of the nurses in Nepal, we spent $700 US per year to help her get through a 3-year degree. So by sacrificing as little as $2,100, my wife Amy and I said, this is so worth it. We'll spend less money on ourselves. We'll help this young woman, Prem Kumari, go through university. And if people check out our website at yougouniversity.org, they can see the videos, some of the young women we've helped. So for me, that's the next frontier, Ani. It is to say, let's shatter the glass ceiling that holds young women in low-income countries back, and let's get them in a university and help them to find their way to good jobs, economic empowerment, and the opportunity to take better care of their families as they earn income.
No, that's really great. And these young women will change not only their lives, but the lives of their families and their communities. It's very interesting. I will surely follow your new endeavors. They're very interesting. I am really impressed by the enthusiasm and the power you have and the ideas you're coming with.
Well, I've got a lot of energy, but I think what I have the most energy for is just really taking a creative approach to one's life and one's career. And if people are listening to this because they're considering making a change or hoping to make a change, what I just tell people is you're the only master of your own destiny. There's a lot of people who can try to talk you out of it or tell you reasons that it won't work. I certainly went through that with Room to Read. And then I had people tell me that I was crazy to leave Room to Read to start YouGo. Why would you want to do that, John? Startups are hard. Startups are time consuming. You could just coast for a few years. But I'm not the kind of guy who likes to coast. I like to take on big challenges. I like to build teams. And so that's for me the future with YouGo is I'm not going to be happy until we have at least 10,000 young women in university with our support.
That's a great goal. And I remember when I came to you to ask you for advice when I was planning to leave my career, and you told me 2 things. So the first time was give yourself time to get into the new environment and start noticing the world around you. That was the first thing you said. And the second was, it's good to have a plan of what you're going to do after you leave the corporate life. But just remember that what you're planning now might change quite a bit, because when you live this different life, many new opportunities will open in front of you and you would never even thought about them. So this was so true. I'm 8 months down the line, and whatever you said happened exactly as you said it, because now I have opportunities which I never thought about. Absolutely never.
I'm so happy my advice turned out to be true. That doesn't always happen. So let's count this as a blessing that we were 2 for 2 on that advice.
Yeah. This was a great conversation, John. So many great advices and a lot of interesting story. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I wish you all the best with all your endeavors.
Thank you. And I wish anybody listening who's considering changes, I wish them the best. It's a fun journey. It's not for everyone, but if you're thinking about making a change in your life, take a deep breath. Go for it. Believe in yourself and see what happens.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Change is Possible podcast. I hope you enjoyed. If there is any topic that you're interested in or would like to nominate a guest, please drop me a message via LinkedIn. Have a great day. Bye.